So many of you might know Tom Dunne. Of course, I know him because this is the second time Tom has done a program for us at the library. The first time was basically with a lot of firefighting community, and I think we had 250 firefighters from all over Westchester County. But right now, Tom has changed a little bit, and he's now retired, and he had a 33-year career in the New York City Fire Department, and he fought hundreds of fires, survived near-death incidences, crawled under burning hallways, met unforgettable characters, and witnessed the 9/11 terrorist attack. From working in glittering Midtown Manhattan high-rises to squalid ghetto tenements, he saw how people in crisis lived and survived, and how firefighters who served them worked and bonded. His new book is called Notes from the Underground, Memoir of a Fire Department. So please welcome Tom Dunne. Oh, and by the way, if you have a question at any time, please put it in the chat function, which you will find on the horizontal menu at the bottom of your screen. So now please welcome Chief Tom Dunne. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, my appreciation to you, Joan, and to the library for giving me an opportunity to once again speak to people from the community and from Westchester County and from wherever about the book. I'm speaking from home, which is why I'm not wearing a mask. So I hope that everyone out there is more than anything else doing well and staying healthy in the pandemic. Thanks to everyone who tunes in today, by the way. I want to talk about the book today, and to tell you the truth, rather than my talking nonstop at you for the next 40 minutes or so, I thought it would be far more interesting if I took a series of photographs from the book and show that to reinforce some of the stories and the storyline of what we're going to talk about today. I even have two brief recordings of some Fireground radio transmissions that can kind of give you more of a flavor of what it's like to be a firefighter. I'm sure we have a bunch of firefighters out there watching, but I didn't write the book exclusively for firefighters. I really wanted to write something that would encompass interest for people who've never been in firefighting. Perhaps who want to know more about aspects of New York City that a lot of people don't get to see. I'd like to address that. Some of the incidents, some of the more notable incidents and experiences I had on the job. And since this is an author talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about the writing process, along with perhaps a little bit about my background. So again, welcome. I hope you find this interesting. If anyone has a point or a question, I will give you a contact at the end of the PowerPoint where you can direct a question directly to me, and I'm sure Joan can handle any points or questions that come up over the next half hour or so. So briefly, my background. I grew up in the city. I grew up in Brooklyn, on the waterfront of Brooklyn. This is what I grew up looking at. This is Manhattan. It was like a distant planet to us in my neighborhood. As kids, we hung out by the docks, played ball in the street, all the traditional urban things. And I grew up in the city, gave me a good feel for what the city was like. Never really thought too much about the fire department, even though this man, my dad, was a tremendous influence in my life. This is my father, Frank Dunne. This is him actually in the Army in World War II. And my dad served 29 years with the New York City Fire Department. Quite frankly, I never would have even thought of becoming a firefighter if I hadn't been influenced by my dad, who kind of didn't push me in that direction, but kind of suggested that I consider doing that at some point in my life. So again, I didn't want to write a book that was only about firefighting. I wanted to write a book about challenge, about change, about transition, about how people go through their lives, experiencing things and influencing things, and how you can develop yourself as an individual and how your life experiences shape and affect you, which certainly encompasses the firefighting world, but basically anyone out there goes through similar experiences over the course of time. So it's a book about change, transition. This is, again, my dad in the background. You can see him coming home from work. That's me at probably about the age of 3, welcoming my father home from work. And you can tell from that ancient old Dodge in the background, this is from the 1950s. I want to talk about what it was like to go from that to this. All right, flash forward another 50 years or so, and now I'm a completely different person, doing a job I could not have imagined doing, a job that was very stressful, very fulfilling, very challenging, and at times kind of dangerous. So most obvious question maybe for perhaps the first raise is, why become a firefighter? And I'd like to tell you that it was a childhood dream, but it was not. I'd like to tell you that it was something that I pursued from the age of 3. I did not. I never really gave it much thought at all. I had a very traditional type of background where I went to school. I did various types of jobs. For a number of years, I worked for the state, and my job essentially was I was a job developer who went out and developed openings for people who were collecting welfare to try to help them get unemployment rolls. And in theory, it was a very important role, I guess, but very honestly, I was completely bored with it. I got very little fulfillment out of it. Early on in my life, and this is probably in my 20s or so, I bounced kind of around from job to job. I was not very much a commitment type of person, and that reflected in my work. Okay, and that probably reflected in a lot of aspects of my life back then. Um, like I said, my dad was an influence. He at one point said, take the firefighters exam. They gave the New York City firefighters exam about every 4 years. Upwards of 30,000 people would apply for it, so you had to do really well. So to kind of listen to my dad, I took the test, and it came along at just the right time. Just about the time when I was kind of fed up and ready for a change. It came, and I jumped on the job. Again, in all honesty, I viewed it as a temporary thing. My thoughts of becoming a firefighter, even though I had sort of watched my father do it for years, were that it would be a 1-year experience. I just wanted to see what it would be like and just experience it, then move on to something else. I had no idea it would turn into a 33-year experience. Okay, let me address why I wrote the book. And these are some of the reasons listed right here. One thing I did not list is the challenge. It was kind of a challenge to me. The thought of writing a book seemed like a monumental task, even though I had written certain things, shorter items, magazine articles in the past, and loved reading. I could not envision myself being an author. And I'm married to an author. My wife is Suzanne Chazen, who has at this point published 9 novels. So I knew writing from a distance. But major reasons why I decided to write this book after spending so much time in the fire department, to tell the story of an interesting story, I hope, about life in the city, about life growing up in the city, about life viewing the underbelly of New York City, seeing scenes and experiencing things most people don't get to see, illuminating a slice of life. Okay, if you have not been a firefighter, there's a whole world out there, the whole culture, subculture of firefighting. And the last one is pretty significant too. Air out feelings, air out my feelings. You go through 33 years of this type of work, and I'm certain anyone who's out there who's been a firefighter, be an EMT, a police officer, certainly anyone who's been in the service and seen combat or something of that nature, you develop a lot of things you hold inside of you when you experience some pretty dramatic things in your life. So these are some of the reasons why I bothered to sit down finally and write the book. For example, I talked about some of the things that you see, and this is a typical top floor fire. This one happens to be in the Bronx. And I think that anyone who's out there who's been a firefighter has probably experienced what these men are doing here. For those of you who are not firefighters, this is a top floor fire in a wooden frame building. And the typical strategy is to cut a hole in the roof which enables the heat and the smoke and the fire to shoot out and enable the engine company inside to advance on the fire and put it out. You experience this from different perspectives as a firefighter. You could be the person on that roof or one of the firefighters on that roof who's using tools and power source to create that opening. And as a firefighter, I did experience that on numerous occasions, but it's also, I also have the opportunity to have the perspective of a chief officer, the person, the incident commander, the person standing in front of this building, supervising these firefighters, not doing the physical work, but communicating and trying to coordinate. And quite honestly, I found that far more stressful than actually doing the physical work, because as you could see, I'd be watching, in this case, just a few of my men performing their jobs dangerously close to an enormous body of fire, just worried about getting them hurt. So these were some of the images that you go and you experience in the world of firefighting. Things like this. This is a fully involved church fire from years ago. Some of the things you see, some of the things I saw on the Fireground are actually stunningly beautiful. If you think about it, fire is a force of nature, and a lot of nature, especially dangerous aspects of nature, can be extremely impressive and beautiful, despite the fact that they're very dangerous. Prime example here of a building fully involved in the middle of the night. You pull up to this, and it's just a scene that almost mesmerizes you. It's so unusual, almost as if a bomb went off and you're there trying to handle the situation, trying to figure a starting point of what to do. Just scenes that get etched in your mind and you never quite really get them out of your mind. Then there's the internal views, all right? Those of you who grew up in the city, perhaps lived in tenements or apartments, this is very typical of an interior stairway in a New York City tenement. This is identical to an apartment house I grew up in Brooklyn for many years. The difference being, I had the good fortune of growing up in a blue collar, but very nice and safe neighborhood where everybody seemed to be a cop or a teacher or a factory worker. It wasn't like that all the time in the city. This particular staircase is in a Bronx tenement. And having seen so many of these, it really opened my mind up in my view towards how people who are not that well off go through life sometimes. You can see their stairway is dirty. You can see that there are graffiti marks. The window is closed. How often did I go up and down these stairs where there were hoses snaked around and water leaking, and that window would be shattered because the firefighters would have to break the window to let the smoke out of the building. So you get to experience this interior world. And I've spent a lot of years in the Bronx. Most of my heavy fire duty was in the Bronx. And I found that most of the Bronx people were pretty decent people. It's just that if they lived in a building like this, if there were, let's say, 12 or 13 or 14 apartments, generally there'd be 10 or 11 really decent people who just lived there and went to work. And then that might be that one person or one group of people who were drug dealers or irresponsible or whatever and would ruin it for everyone else. So like I said earlier, I got to see the underbelly of New York City, got to experience how other people grow up in not such great environments. And of course, 9/11, you can't really, I think, talk about the history of New York City, or certainly the history of the New York City Fire Department, and not address this to some extent. I did dedicate an entire chapter in the book to 9/11. So let's talk about the beginning. Beginning of my career, all right, beginning of any New York City firefighter's career. There's an island in New York City called Randall's Island. It's under the Triborough Bridge. A lot of Randall's Island is kind of nice parks and ball fields, but there's a little core area that holds the training facility for the New York City Fire Department, Randall's Island Training Facility. And these are two current day pictures that I took of Randall's Island. This is the smokehouse. And one of the chapters I wrote in the book is about the smokehouse. Um, the FDNY, like most major urban fire departments, is a quasi-military organization. Um, I was not a military type of person. I was a little bit of a loose cannon. I did not fit well initially into this whole quasi-military atmosphere. The first couple of weeks was basically marching about, getting yelled at this way and that way. I was not thrilled with that. It took a great deal of adjustment, being somewhat of a free spirit. Um, I did get, one thing I really did love in Randall's Island in a training, which is called Proby School, which stands for Probationary Firefighter. I did love the hands-on aspect of it. I loved the running. I loved the exercise. I loved when we actually did the physical things, the hands-on types of things. One of the first things I remember doing was climbing up an aerial ladder. And fortunately, I didn't seem to have much of a fear of heights, and I just loved that experience. Uh, I also learned other things there. For example, I almost ended my career probably in the third week of training. We were about to do an evolution where they were going to tie off a rope to one of the chimneys on the top of this building. The training tower was about 4 stories high, and you would actually rappel down the side of a building with this rope. And as a brand new trainee, I was so excited about doing this. I remember standing on the parapet on the edge of the roof, and I had a metal hook that I had wrapped the rope around that I was going to slide down. And I was just really gung ho and excited about doing this. And just as I swung my leg around the parapet to start sliding, one of the instructors grabbed me and pulled me right back. And what I had missed completely in my myopic excitement was that no one had tied off the back of the rope to a substantial object. And if I had gone over that roof, I would have gone straight down and ended my career right there. So I learned to um, ease back, pace myself, and take a broader perspective than just looking at something really exciting. The smokehouse itself, this is the modern facility. It replaced a squat, ugly, dirty building that existed a couple of decades ago, where you would be sent into the building to acclimate yourself to actual smoke. I don't know if this is still something they do. I suspect OSHA may have limited this, possibly ended this. The buildings you see here are modern facilities that are fed by propane fires. Back when I went through the training, there was no propane fires. Basically, it was a series of steel containers, and they would throw wood and pieces of stuff, refuse in there, light up the fire, crank up the smoke really good, and then lead you into the building. And this was scheduled for towards the end of the training period. So we kept hearing about how horrible it was, how uncomfortable, how painful it was to experience this. And we got more and more concerned as we went through the training process, because we knew this was staring us in the face at some point. And the first time you went in, they allowed you to go with your face piece on, with your mask. And I kind of describe it in the book. It was almost like going through a ride in Disneyland. It was painless. They very quickly replaced that with sending you in there with no mask, having you crawl in below the smoke, and then standing up in the smoke. And while you were standing up, they would interrogate you and ask you questions. And I went around the holiday season, so they demanded that you start singing Christmas carols. And you would be standing in the smoke gagging and so painful. And the whole idea was to advise you, to teach you that even if your mask ran out, you're capable of surviving for a while. So you learned how to deal with the physical aspects of the job. You also learned how to deal with the psychological aspects, how to deal with your fears. Okay, the culture. Again, I realize I'm talking probably to a mixed group. Some of you have been firefighters perhaps for years. Some of you probably have never been in a firehouse kitchen. The job I came on in New York City in 1981 was radically different than the FDNY that exists today in 2021. When I came on the job, uh, a lot of old so-called war year veterans were still active, were still people that were on the job. The war years are a term they used to describe that period from the late 60s to about 1972 or so, where whole neighborhoods of the Bronx and Brooklyn were burning every night. And some of the men that I worked with who broke me in were veterans who had experienced that. And I would hear stories from them where they would literally go from fire to fire. And over the course of, let's say, a 15-hour night tour, they might go to 10 or 11 or 12 extra structural fires. And thankfully, that period ended. New York City was still fairly busy back then, and certainly they get more than their share of fire today. Uh, but it was a rough, tough culture. The guys that broke me in were the salt of the earth. Um, I wasn't an easy fit for a firehouse kitchen. Uh, they tended to be tough blue collar guys. I tended to be pretty quiet and somewhat cerebral. Uh, a lot of them were real big beer drinkers. I like a beer periodically, but I was not very much, and I'm not very much of a drinker. So it took me a while to mesh with this culture. I always felt a little bit out of sync with the culture. That being said, one of the funniest places you'll ever experience is the firehouse kitchen. I wrote about some of the episodes in the book. You'll get occasionally into some really interesting discussions in a firehouse kitchen. I had newer day coworkers who were lawyers. One fellow was an architect. Uh, the culture was a rough, tough culture. Uh, it was not an easy fit for me, but I think I got some really nice experiences about it and try to highlight some of it in the book. All right, life as a firefighter. I could throw a lot of things on here, but I threw 3 bullet points that really kind of highlighted my experience as a firefighter. I could have thrown on fulfillment there and fun, because I really did enjoy the job. What was originally intended as a 1-year experience, as I said, turned out to be a 33-year, a multi-decade experience for me. But at least starting as a firefighter, the exhaustion. It was brutally difficult work. It was very hard work. If you can imagine wearing a lot of gear, and let's say if you work in a tenement district, walking up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, carrying all this gear with a heavy air pack on your back. And once you get up to that 4th or 5th floor, your work is just starting, because you have to force your way into a door, perhaps stretch a hose line, break windows, um, search around looking for victims. And even after that's done, you're going to be taking that apartment apart, doing the overhaul to check for extension. It was very hands-on, and I enjoyed that aspect of the work. And I found it to be almost a sensual job, in a sense that so much of our work and so much of the work I had done in my life prior to being a firefighter was sort of this digital age stuff where we dealt with concepts and things and ideas. This was hands-on. This was smoke. This was fire. This was dirt. This was stuff that you could sense and you could feel. I early on had the experience of, I'm sure every fireman's had the experience of, you work at a fire, you get dirty, you go home and shampoo, and sometimes after 2 or 3 shampoos, you can still smell that smoke in your hair. So it was a very sensual thing. Here's an example of some of the hands-on stuff. This is a fella at nighttime using a power saw, a forcible entry saw, to cut his way through a metal lock to get access to a building. Again, spectacular, sensual, visually very impressive. Something that made a tremendous amount of noise, which added to the almost stress and the background of being a firefighter. This is an aerial ladder, all right? You can tell from the palm trees all the way at the bottom of the ladder that this is a shot that someone from Florida sent me. But I like the picture because it kind of shows what it feels like to be at the top of an aerial ladder. The aerial ladders basically were 75 feet, some were longer. But I've had a number of experiences climbing up and down these area ladders as a firefighter. Again, this sensual, hands-on type of thing. Um, Interestingly, when you climb one of these things, and again, I'm sure the firefighters out there who may be watching can verify this, you would think of it as being a stable thing because it's big, it's heavy, it's metal, it's got these handrails. But the thing actually moves, it bounces as you're climbing up the ladder. And they do that for a reason. Ideally, they want to place that ladder not right on a windowsill, but maybe just a few inches above it. The thinking being that as you advance your way up this ladder, your weight is going to press the tip of the ladder on the windowsill and stabilize that ladder, which is especially important if there's someone at that window that you want to get out of the building, okay? Or if you in turn have to go in the building yourself. And I can remember at a couple of fires where, especially working in ladder companies, where my assignment was to get to the roof of the fire building to start cutting those roof holes we displayed in the previous slide to allow the fire to vent itself. And if you can imagine, maybe you're doing this at night and maybe it's snowing and you've got your helmet and your mask and your gear on, and maybe you have the power source strapped over your shoulder and maybe an axe and a hook or something in your left hand, and you're climbing up this thing and the ladder is bouncing. It's something that takes some getting used to. I remember clearly one of the images that stays so clearly in my mind. I worked a lot of years in Mid-Manhattan as a firefighter, and I was sent up an aerial ladder to probably what was the 6th or 7th story of a building, which would be like 65, 70 feet up in the air. And they wanted me to get in the window because an alarm was going off. And rather than force their way into the building and do some damage, they wanted me to see if there was a false alarm or if there was a smoke condition. And I remember getting up to the very top. And again, I dealt pretty well with heights. It didn't bother me. But I remember as I was swinging into the window, my right hand was holding on to the top rung. And I remember looking at the tendons in my wrist. And for a split second, I thought, geez, that's all that's keeping me from falling down to the street. And if I allowed myself to concentrate on that, it would be too scary to do the job. So one of the things I learned, one of the things I was able to develop over time was not to have too much of an imagination, not to think too much about the bad possibilities, about the worst case scenarios, but just to calm yourself down and function as best you can. Okay. It's also, I mentioned it's a sensual job. It's a very dirty job, or can be. This is 2 photographs I took of some of my gear. The boots on the left were boots that I used when I first came on the job. These became obsolete probably about 25 years ago. The helmet on the right is the helmet I wore as a chief for probably 15 to 20 years. And you can see that the job, the gear reflects the job, and the job itself reflects the physical aspect of firefighting, which again was something that I did enjoy because I was dealing with actual physical experiences, whether I was a firefighter or a company officer or a chief supervising an activity. I was dealing with the forces of nature, heat, smoke, gravity. Initially, when you came on the job, you had to lay out close to $1,000 to buy your own gear, and you would bring that gear to and from work sometimes if you were sent to another area of the city to do a job. And that was, thankfully was replaced probably about 20 years ago with a quartermaster system, whereby you get all the gear for free from the fire department, and they give you this nice big red bag to carry it around as you move from different work assignments. Wasn't always that way. I remember as a newly promoted officer, I at times had to bring the gear home, actually clean it on the porch of my house, which would be, OSHA would absolutely, not accept that today, but that's kind of the way it was. To a certain extent, grit and dirt was a sign of experience and seniority. It was kind of admired. If you had a beat up old helmet and beat up fire gear, they looked at you as kind of a veteran. I even worked with a new guy, a probie, a first year firefighter, who took his brand new black helmet stuck it in the kitchen stove in the oven because he wanted to age it a little bit so he wouldn't look too new. So it was a dirty job also. Very traditional job. Um, Two of the questions I most often get from people who are not in the fire service are, do you have a Dalmatian? No, I do not. And do you slide the pole? Yes, I did slide the pole for many years and actually quite enjoyed it. This is two photos I took of sliding pole. I had the opportunity, having had a father in the fire service, to go to a firehouse as a kid and visit him and spend a little time there. And I clearly remember the first time as probably a 10-year-old sliding down my first pole. And if you look at the photo to the right, it's probably, I would say, 25 feet or so. And you can imagine as a kid, you're looking down there, it looks like, you'd be sliding down to South America. It's a little scary, but I remember my dad at the bottom waiting for me, and this tremendous sense of accomplishment and exhilaration I had when I actually slid the pole. Um, I didn't know and couldn't know at the time that years later I would be, as an adult, as a firefighter, as a company officer, and even as a chief, sliding down these poles. And again, it was kind of a sensual physical sensation. There were different types of poles. These are brass poles, um, very, very slick, very shiny. The pole kind of wobbled and moved with you. They had other poles that were stainless steel that were solid and didn't move. And they were somewhat industrial and didn't feel the same. But it was a very, very traditional um, institution with a lot of traditional experiences like this. With the tradition is the history. Every fire unit in New York City, and I would venture to say in other urban cities, Boston or Detroit or wherever, there's a company journal, which is this large book here, which essentially hasn't changed in 100 years. If you went to a firehouse today, you would have a version of this book with today's date, 2021 in it. And I'm the type of person who's fascinated with history, but very much so hands-on history. And one of the things I always enjoyed doing was going, especially in Manhattan, where the older firehouses were, was to go up and explore these ancient lofts where you'd have company journals like this that literally hadn't been touched in decades, in some cases, maybe 100 years. And I would climb up and find these things and open them up. And I one day hit pay day. I was working at an engine company in mid-Manhattan, went up to an ancient loft, came across an ancient fire journal from that unit. And I was fascinated by what I saw. First of all, you open it up and you see that beautiful 19th century handwriting that they had. And if you look at this particular page, it's August 11th, 1873, and a firefighter named David McBride suddenly is making entries. And when I dug this up, I could really identify with it because here I was over a century later, um, working in the same firehouse, looking at this book, you know, just as this guy David McBride did, who was a firefighter. And to put it into a historical perspective, in 1873, the New York City Fire Department had only existed for 8 years. David McBride was most likely a Civil War veteran. At that time, Ulysses S. Grant was the president of the United States, and the Brooklyn Bridge hadn't been built. And General Armstrong Custer of Custer's Last Stand was still gallivanting out somewhere in Wyoming, killing Indians. He had not yet been killed by the Indians himself. So I was really fascinated by this hands-on touch with history of the FDNY. As I was leafing through this book, in fact, I found a metal wrapper that was actually an old tobacco wrapper from that period. And I thought, gee, David McBride was probably sitting in this very firehouse, maybe at this very desk in 1873, probably rolling a cigarette or something. He probably got a run and he dropped his pen, put the tobacco wrapper in the book, closed the book, and here I come 144 years later, in this case, and I'm picking up the same thing. I'm probably the first man in 144 years to pick up something that David McBride dropped years ago. And I remember just at that point, we got a run, and I took the silver foil, folded it up, put it in my pocket, and responded. And it was kind of interesting and ironic that here, so much time later, I was responding with that very same tobacco wrapper in mid-Manhattan. Okay, since this is an author talk, a couple of brief comments about the writing process. And let me say, first of all, that I suspect that there may be people out there watching this or who will watch recordings of this who are far more productive and experienced writers than I am. I'm relatively new, I'm brand new to writing books, but perhaps my somewhat naive, fresh view of writing might be of interest to anyone who's out there who perhaps is currently writing something or giving some thought to writing something. The writing process, for me, was not an easy thing. Okay, if you look at this lady here, there were moments when I felt very much like what she's experiencing here. I did have the opportunity to write about 20 feature articles, magazine articles, but those were for a technical magazine, Fire Engineering. And I got to do those over the course of years where I would write about maybe an experience I had on the job or a particular fire I had or something about a thought I had about procedures that might be good for future firefighters. But I never wrote a book. And I was taking notes for years, probably for about 5 or 6 or 7 years, little incidents that I had experienced that I thought might be interesting to relate if I ever put together in a book. The book went through a couple of iterations. I initially thought of it as an attempt as a technical book where I would perhaps talk about a particular incident and use that as a learning point for firefighters. But the more I thought about it, the less enthusiasm I had for that. I wanted to write something far more personal. I wanted to write something that was not only for firefighters for how to do book, but something that would relate to feelings and emotions and experiences that, whether you were a firefighter or not, might be of interest to you. It is and was, without a doubt, a very humbling process. If you are thinking of writing, don't quit your day job. Okay, fortunately, I had a very good day job, which I enjoyed very much. Be prepared to deal with rejection. I went through numerous rejections when I tried to get to publish the book. It took quite some time to do that. You're going to get some criticism. I found the times I resisted criticism, then I stepped back and realized, no, there's a purpose to criticism. Perhaps I didn't word that the way I should. Perhaps this chapter is not significant. Perhaps that one should be given more weight. But I did develop a discipline of writing over time to a point where, as hard, as challenging, and as humbling as it was, I got more and more into it. And I found that I could sit down some days and really, really work at it. It got to a point where what seemed like an overwhelming challenge of writing a book wasn't as overwhelming as I thought. And I even managed just recently to try my next shot at writing, which is to write a novel. I just finished a novel. I'm currently in the very slow and very tedious rewriting and editing process. But that was my experience with writing. If anyone is aspiring to write out there, again, from a novice, a relatively new book author, my advice to you would be persistent and write from your heart and write from what you know. Okay, let's talk about, again, moving up in the fire department. You start as a firefighter, you do the hands-on work. Many men stay at that level because either they enjoy it, and there's certainly a lot of enjoyment to being a firefighter, or perhaps they have side jobs that keep them from doing the studying that's necessary to go through the various ranks. This is essentially how it works in the FDNY. You're a firefighter. If you want to get promoted, there's a tremendous amount of studying and examination that has to be done to go to be a lieutenant. Now you are no longer a firefighter responsible just for yourself. Now you are in charge of a company of firefighters, which would be 4 or 5 guys. So your span of control is different. Your responsibility is different. The next step up is to be a captain. All right. Each firehouse has usually three lieutenants and a captain. The captain is the person who's administratively in charge of running that firehouse. But he too, at a fire or an incident, is again supervising just 4 or 5 firefighters. Um, it's a huge jump from firefighter to lieutenant because you're becoming a supervisor for the first time. It's an equally big jump to go from captain, from company officer to battalion chief. Now you're a chief. Now you're the person standing outside the building. You're the person in most cases who gets there and sets up the initial strategy of the attack for that fire. Um, I chose to continue studying and eventually became a deputy chief, which I'll talk about in a bit. And now you truly are the guy in charge. Now you're have 2 or 3 or 4 battalion chiefs working below you, helping you out, and you're assigning them to things. And rather than being in charge of just yourself as you are as a firefighter, or just 4 or 5 firefighters as a company officer, now you may be supervising 160 people or more. So that's kind of the route I took. Um, Again, what was going to be a 1 year experience turned out to be a 33-year career where I got to fortunately go through all of these ranks. All right, so you become a boss, all right, company officer. First step I took, I had 6 years on the job at the time, not a heck of a lot, probably not enough time. I was definitely not ready for this first promotion. I would expand that and say that I don't think, if you go back to this, I don't think I was ready for any of these promotions when they came along. I had to go through the very slow and painful process of learning to be a company officer, of learning to be a supervisor, of becoming a battalion chief, and eventually stepping back and being the guy who runs the whole operation. Not a comfortable experience initially. It took some time to get used to it. When I got promoted to lieutenant, to company officer, my my environment, my work environment changed dramatically. This is kind of like what I was dealing with for the most part as a firefighter. Manhattan, lower Manhattan, mid Manhattan, high-rise buildings, for the most part, pretty wealthy, good neighborhoods. When I got promoted to my first rank of lieutenant, company officer, I was sent to the Bronx. Um, Radically different culture. Okay, uh, when I worked as a lieutenant in the Bronx in the mid to late 1980s, the Bronx was not what it was in the so-called war years in the late 60s, early 70s, where they were going to 15, 20 fires a night. There was still a substantial amount of work there. There were still quite a few vacant buildings. We still did a fair amount of work. There were tours where we would get maybe 2 or 3 fires a night. It was rare that we didn't go to a fire. And this is where I really started to not only experience um, being a firefighter more so than Manhattan, although I did see some work, a lot of work in Manhattan. This is where I really got a sense of the underbelly of New York City, where I got to see how the other half lived, so to speak, people who weren't as fortunate. Back then, there were still frequent shootings. Um, Drugs were rampant, and anytime there's crime and drugs, it seems like a lot of fire follows along. So it was a physical change, a geographical change, a tremendous cultural change. Um, I talk about 2 fires in depth in the book. I dedicate 2 chapters. One is the Happy Land Social Club fire, which occurred 1990. Um, you probably heard of it. It happened literally 79 years to the date of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire back in 1911, just by circumstance. And I write in the book of how I actually drove past this club 2 days before the fire. I was assigned to work in a company nearby, and I remember driving past and just glancing over at the building and seeing this sign, Happy Land Social Club. And I remember thinking as I stopped for a red light, they looked very happy. It was a sad-looking club, a sad-looking neighborhood. I, I, I had no idea that I'd be coming back in about 48 hours to what was a tragedy where 87 mostly young people died in this club. And I wasn't actually sent to the fire. I was sent with my company when the fire was out, and essentially our job was to go into the club and start picking up and bagging bodies. And you talk about images that that stay in your mind. I so clearly remember going up the stairway to the second floor, and it was as if, I don't know, there were dozens and dozens of bodies, and it's as if they all had just fallen asleep. Um, they weren't burnt, they just had inhaled this tremendous heat and smoke, a sudden blast of heat and smoke from the floor below, and just fell down. And I remember being there for several hours, supervising my men as we bagged the bodies and trying desperately to figure out whose purse was whose. And I found myself concentrating on one woman, young woman in particular, and I was really moved because one of my men, as he was maneuvering her, said, "She's not a big girl," as if she was still alive. And I remember looking at that thinking, well, now this is terrible, but he's treating her with the dignity that she deserves. And now looking back at this decades later, um, the image is still there. And you think of that one woman in particular and realize that, geez, if she had survived that, she'd probably have her own kids right now, be talking about how she liked to dance in this club. Ironically, the fire was started by one enraged man who was very angry at his girlfriend who worked in the club. He came by, splashed gasoline on the first floor, lit it up, and wound up killing 87 people. His girlfriend survived. And when I think about this, I think about something that was persistent throughout my career, chain of events. If he had not done that, if he had gotten drunk or did something other than express himself by lighting a place on fire, the chain of events, so many people would have been alive. Um, the other fire I get into somewhat depth, there's a fire. I don't have a picture of the building per se, but I had a brush with mortality in a tenement building in Harlem on West 133rd Street that really prepared me for being a chief. It was the most individually frightening moment I ever had as a firefighter in the FDNY, maybe conceivably the most frightening moment in my life. And at this point, I'm a captain with an engine company, working in a Harlem engine company in the daytime. We pulled out of the block. We come in first due to what was a vacant 5 or 6 story tenement building that's burning away. And I remember going in the first floor, leading my men. We stretched the first line, and we look up the stair, and all we saw was stair after stair of fire. The whole thing was involved. And I'm kind of mesmerized by this, and I'm thinking, we're not going to put this fire out. And at that exact moment, the battalion chief who was standing out in the street supervising calls me and says, "Get your guys out. We're not going to fight this fire interior attack. We're going to set up exterior streams," which was a great call. Just as he said that, I lead my men towards the rear exit, and a huge portion of the rear of the building starts falling down. And all of a sudden, what was perfectly clear becomes completely dark. And I remember walking towards the rear exit, hoping that, we get out of this before the thing falls on us completely. And rather than going alone, one of the firefighters with me had the same instinct I had. We couldn't even see each other, but our instinct was not to just run out of that building, but we wrapped our arms around each other, even though we had a delay for a second or two to do that, because I didn't want to leave him, he didn't want to leave me. And I remember being so touched by this guy who I didn't even know would slow himself down to help me. And I guess he felt the same about me, that I wouldn't leave without him. It really reinforced the brotherhood aspect of being a firefighter. And aside from that, it prepared me for my next move, which was to be a chief. Right now, I was the person in the street looking up at these buildings. All right. I was the person who had that awesome responsibility, who had to make that instantaneous decision to either continue fighting a fire from the interior or pulling my people out, because from everything I'm sensing in the street, which is often somewhat limited, I remember that incident of being inside the building. It really impressed me and stayed with me of how good this chief was to do that for us. So I started as a battalion chief. I had to learn certain skills. One of the skills is what you see this golfer doing here, which is to ignore the fire. All right. Don't get mesmerized by the fire. Consider the other things that are going on. Think about other problems? Is it going to put other buildings on fire? Is it going to expand? I had to learn to almost ignore the visible fire and think beyond it. It brought certainly new stresses because now I'm not responsible for myself or 4 or 5 people, but upwards of 160 or more people. And that leads me to the lie. I don't like to read to people or be read to for that matter, but there's one paragraph in the book I do want to just briefly read if I could, if you could indulge me on this. I talk in the book about 2 different fires I had. The first fire as a brand new battalion chief in Brooklyn, and then the second fire 20 years later as a very experienced deputy chief in the Bronx. And there are similarities between the two because in each fire, we came across a man who was deceased, who had been burnt and was found lying in the bathroom of the apartment. And the first fire, I'm a brand new chief, I'm somewhat naive, and I remember feeling really upset about what I was seeing, only to find out that the man that they had uncovered in the Brooklyn fire had actually set the fire for insurance purposes. And then years later, as a deputy chief, in a very similar type of building, very similar situation, I see another man, another deceased man lying in a bathroom in a very similar type of building. And as a deputy chief, one of my jobs was to do a very intricate report anytime there was a fatality. And I remember walking around the apartment and taking my measurements, doing what I had to do. When I got back in the street, a woman who turned out to be this man's wife, okay, comes up to me in the street in the Bronx and starts asking for a husband. And I talk about in the book how now I'm really on the spot. I don't know what to do or what to say. I don't want to publicly just turn around to her in front of all these people and say, I'm sorry, your husband's gone. I remember leading her over to a police officer who probably broke the news to her. But again, the book is not only about firefighting, it's about change, it's about challenge, it's about evolving. And I just could read, if you could indulge me, just to read this one paragraph here in the chapter called The Lie. It kind of, I think, crystallizes some of the things I tried to talk about in the book. So I say here, nearly 20 years separated the Brooklyn and Bronx fires, but they had a lot in common. The men who died were about the same age and were similar in appearance, and each had wives who were nervously pacing in the nearby streets. The big difference is that one of them was in the process of trying to improve the home he lived in, while the other was trying to destroy his home for profit. And the other difference was me. I was not the same incident commander in Brooklyn that I was in the Bronx, nor was I the same individual. 20 years of this work had made me a good chief and by necessity, a different person. But I wonder if in the process of becoming that person, I had lost something. And if a hardening of the emotions is just as much of a job hazard as a hardening of the arteries. Kind of like I say, it was a journey, and I changed. And in the course of that journey, when I became a deputy chief over the years, as a deputy chief, by the way, I was truly on my own. Okay, now the people from headquarters wouldn't be there for a long time. I had the job, I had the responsibility, I had decisions I had to make. I had to step up and lead, learn to organize a division that had upwards of 1,000 people and about 40 units. I had to learn to de-stress both myself and the people that were working for me. I had to learn to deal and handle with a lot of stress as a deputy chief. I had to learn to improvise. And I love this photo because I didn't ever personally have to do this myself, but I know this happened on a number of occasions where a car would be parked right on the hydrant and they would have to actually break through the windows to hook up to the hydrant. And I suspect that the guys who did this always got a little kick out of doing it, especially if it was a BMW like this car is. Okay, setting the tone. Again, as a deputy chief, I had to set the tone for an operation. And as an example, this is not the building, but it's a very similar type of structure to a fire I had. If you can envision the scenario, it's winter, it's single digits, it's about 7 degrees. I'm going to play 2 quick audios for you just to give you a flavor of what it's like to be on the Fireground in New York City, especially when you're trying to run a very complex and dangerous operation. This is the rear of the building. You'll hear in the recording, they refer to it as the exposure 3 side. And essentially, the exposure 3 side, the rear of the building, what one of the firefighters observed is that a man was standing on that a firefighter was standing on that one-story setback, and then it lit up, and he wasn't sure if the guy was there or not. So I'm in the street listening to a very confusing and very panicky radio message.
I'm okay. You got a member operating an exposure 3 sign. Yeah, no major ingress. No major ingress. Get that fucking at chief. Dying too old. Is everybody off the roof? Squat to roof. Get up. Are you okay? 610 view to command. I'm okay. I observed a member on exposure 3 sign. 2nd floor. No major egress. He was there. And now he's trying to firefighter up on 3 sign. I do not know where he went, man. All right, command September, has the member given a mayday been removed from the building tag? 2-0. 5-1 to 2-0. Go ahead, 5-4. What, see, get a line up on this route.
The whole point of that particular slide, though, is as a deputy chief, one of the skills I had to develop, especially in very difficult situations like this, was the ability to calm myself down and to communicate in a calm manner to resolve the situation. As it turned out, it was okay because the firefighter had removed himself from that setback before it lit up. Okay, again, especially as a chief, especially as a deputy chief, one of the skills, one of the things I had to do, and again, this was without any real training, was to learn to deal with the media. And this was especially true of Mid-Manhattan, because in Mid-Manhattan, it seemed like if you had the slightest incident, the major networks right there, right in your face, interviewing you, trying to get lines from you. When you got into the boroughs, when you worked in the Bronx, like you had the smaller stations like Channel 12, and very often it would be not a large technical crew, but a very young person like this young lady here, maybe one person with a handheld camera. And it was a very different experience than being in Midtown, where you were kind of at the central media point of the world. It took a while to get used to this, to get comfortable with it. One of the things I had to develop, quite frankly, was the ability to talk without saying nothing. And that was especially true if it was a significant fire that involved a fatality or possibly some issue with the building that may have led to the fire. You had to be able to give basic information off the top of your head in a professional manner without really telling them anything that would be damaging to the fire marshal's investigation or to any subsequent legal challenge. For the most part, the media were very easy and cooperative to work with. Once in a while, you'd run into a very aggressive reporter. I can remember one in Midtown following me around, persistently throwing questions at me because he wanted to get me to say something which I refused to say. But for the most part, they were very respectful, very professional. The only exception I can remember, I had a unfortunate experience in the Bronx where a young child died at a fire. And one of the well-known reporters, who I think is still a reporter out there, grabbed the brother of the victim. The victim was a young child, and spoke to him in the street and interviewed him at length before anyone in the fire department had an opportunity to sit down and talk to him. And as it turned out, that the teenager, the young man she was talking to, had actually set the fire. And at that point, didn't even realize that his sister had died in the fire. So that was kind of the exception. And to this day, I occasionally see that reporter on TV, and I still have a bit of a chip on my shoulder for her in particular. But for the most part, the media were cooperative. They were decent people doing a job. They respected us. We respected them. And it was an interesting aspect, because I would go home fairly frequently, especially in Mid-Manhattan. If I had a decent job, a decent fire that day, I would see myself on the 6 o'clock news, and I would kind of critique myself to see if I had given a professional interview or if I had kind of looked a little unprofessional. 9/11, there was a chapter in 9/11. I won't go heavily into that. We're approaching the 20-year anniversary, sad anniversary of that. So much has been said, so much suffering that day and subsequent to that day. I do address it in the book. My 9/11 memory, there's so many of them, but one of the clearest memories I have actually was in July, just a few weeks prior to 9/11. I'm a deputy chief working in Manhattan, and I get a call from a friend of mine who's a battalion chief also working in Manhattan nearby. We have a conversation, we would speak periodically together. We had worked together at Fort Fires in the Bronx. And it was just on the heels of the Father's Day fire, which is almost forgot, but it was a fire in a hardware store in Queens in 2001, where there was an explosion and several firefighters had died. And I remember as we were talking about this fire, he said to me, there, but for the grace of God, go you or I. And we both knew what he was saying. What he was saying was, you don't know what fate has in store for you. All right. That was July, and that's the last conversation I ever had with my friend, because unfortunately, just a few weeks later, he was one of the 343 firefighters and one of the many thousand who got killed on that day. Again, it's something I address in the book, and I don't want to get too lost in it here, but certainly it's something that sticks in all of our minds, whether you're a firefighter or not. We were all affected on that day. Just to finish up, it's a book about change. It's a book about firefighting. It's a book about myself. It's a book about New York City, life in New York City, growing up in New York City. It's a book about the underbelly of New York City, about the things that you don't often see, perhaps, or not aware of. It's also a book about change. This is my Proby class in 1981. It's a long time ago. A lot of things have changed. The city has changed significantly since then. The fire department has changed significantly since then. I don't know if I can, this is me here, standing next to an instructor I really liked, that fellow there. But if you look at that, it's basically a bunch of white guys, right? That's what the fire department was back then for the most part. The fellow in front holding the nozzle is the one non-Caucasian, he's Chinese. He got assigned to Engine 55 out of Proby School because Engine 55 is in Chinatown. So obviously there was some public relations going on there. The department changed so much since then. I changed so much since then. Some of the changes that stayed with me, I got a lot more confident, right? Maybe part of it is age, getting more confidence in general, but I know the work that I did allowed me to go out and write books, allowed me to feel more comfortable in my own skin, allowed me to have the confidence and wherewithal to go out on the lecture circuit and speak to either a small classroom like this, or in some cases at conventions to groups of 300 or 400 people. It gave me an ability to deal with stress a lot better. Having been a firefighter, especially having been a chief officer in the fire department, allowed me to feel more in control of stressful situations. And despite all the ugliness you see in this line of work, it gave me a truer and deeper appreciation for the really good things in life. Today, unfortunately, we're all indoors doing this, but it's a gorgeous day. And having seen so much death and destruction and disruption in my work, I can so much better enjoy the simple pleasures of life right now. It also left me with a thought. I don't think anyone could do this work for any period of time, much less 33 years in New York City, without, to some extent, trying to address the big existential questions of life. What is it all about? Why me? Why was I spared the sickness? Why was I not one who was injured? Why was I not on 9/11 or some of the hundreds of fires I went to? Why was I not injured? Why did I move on? Why is it so many of my friends either were killed or injured, and some are even now suffering post 9/11 illnesses? It's not like I was a better person. I was not. It's not like I was a better chief or a better firefighter. I was not. And you find yourself longing for a belief, a philosophy, a theory, or something to explain it all. It's something that I'm still, I guess, reckoning with. Maybe there are elements of survivor guilt in it. But again, these are some of the big questions I wanted to at least try to approach in the book, rather than just talk about being a firefighter, rather than just talking about what it felt like to be in a fire. So again, whether you're a firefighter or not, I do hope that there's some substance that you can get out of the book and that you enjoy the book. One of the things I mentioned I want to do, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have criticisms, whatever, feel free to contact me. The best way to get in touch with me is through here. This is my website. I always get back to people if they have comments, if they have questions. I think of myself as a fairly good author, but I'm probably the world's worst book salesman. This is my book. I don't push it as much as I should. I didn't write the book for money, but if you're interested, you can get it through the publisher, through Amazon, or directly to me, to my website. So in conclusion, Joan, again, thank you so much for inviting me, and for all the folks that took the time to listen. I hope we touched on some interesting things, and thank you so much. I appreciate
You certainly did. But before you go, there's a question.
Yes.
About Happy Land.
Yes.
Was Happy Land the beginning of the counseling service unit?
I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect that was 1990. I don't know for a fact when the counseling unit actually started. Okay. I suspect it probably existed prior to that. I would think that initially it may have been geared to people who had perhaps drinking problems or marital problems, things of that nature. Again, I didn't work for the counseling unit, so I can't give a specific answer to that. But Happy Lands, I know, took an emotional toll on the people who went there.
Must have. Oh, yeah. I mean, your description of that, of walking in and seeing all the bodies, that's really very hard. I can't imagine the stress that you and all the other firefighters were under when you see something like this. It's beyond comprehension for me. You know, you can see it on television, but it's real in person.
It wasn't even so much, I wouldn't say stress is the appropriate word. I would say it was surreal.
Oh, yeah.
I had seen individual victims at that point, but to see just, 87 bodies lying down as if they fell asleep, it almost felt like it wasn't real. And I could still see it. And as I say, I could still picture this one woman in particular, and my firefighter handling her so gently and saying that as he put her in the body bag, saying she's just a little girl, almost as if she were still alive. And that image just, as horrible as it was, his intent and his gentle approach to that just really stuck with me.
Yeah, well, you've been so honest and so forthright about all these experiences and how it's affected you and how you've grown. And, honestly, as the uninformed, which I am, it's nice to know that the fire departments are on such sensitive and caring people, because you don't know. I mean, you're giving us behind the scenes feeling that you had while you were a fire person, and you don't really. It's hard. It's hard to imagine it. It's just, it's hard for all of us. So thank you, Tom. It's a tough life. You can see.
It's tough. Firefighters are great people. They're tough people.
Oh, I get that.
They are great people too. But again, my sincere thanks to you and to anyone who happened to tune in.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. And I hope you have any questions. Don't forget, Tom sent his chieftomdunne.com. And if you have anything about the library, don't forget, it's at chappaqua.library.org. Thank you all for coming, and have a good weekend, and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.